Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
I'm really looking forward to talking about today's subject with you, Mike, The Unforgettable Picnic, a story which I think is to be found in all four Gospels. Is that right?
Absolutely, David. And in fact, this is the only miracle, apart from the account of the resurrection, that is found in all four Gospels. So that instantly tells us that this story impacted each of the writers and their sources in a particular way.
And which picnic are we talking about?
We're talking about that picnic that's commonly called the feeding of the 5,000 from 5 loaves and 2 fishes.
For anybody who's not heard this story before, tell us what happened.
Well, a quick overview of the story is that Jesus has been busy teaching, probably tired from that, from all his teaching and healing. Matthew and Mark's account tell us that he's just received news of the execution of his friend and relative, John the Baptist. And so Jesus and his disciples get into a boat to cross to the north side of the Sea of Galilee. We've said before, boats were often used as a means of getting around the towns that surrounded that sea very easily. So off he goes on his boat, but the crowds follow him round the coast. They see that he's going somewhere, and so they run along the coast. So when he lands at the other side, he finds that there are yet more crowds there, some new ones who are waiting, some who've caught up from the other side. And that means what? Yet more teaching and healing. And as the day goes on and the number of people who need prayer and healing just seems to keep on growing, it gets late. The disciples suggest, Jesus, they're looking at the equivalent of their watches, not that they had them in those days, but saying, come on, Jesus, getting a bit late. I think it's time to send the crowd away. They need to go to some of the nearby towns and villages and buy some food. But the surprise will come in that rather than sending them away, Jesus makes miraculous provision for them and provides this unforgettable picnic.
You mentioned that Jesus had just heard that somebody he was very close to had been killed. So Jesus is in quite a state of mind and indeed is looking for some R&R.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we just read it, and John the Baptist was beheaded by Herod Antipas for his constantly preaching against him. This was not only a friend, this was family, it was a relative. This was the one whom God had sent as the forerunner to prepare the way for Jesus. So I think the emotional angst in him at this point, the pain that he must have felt would be huge. Add that to, just the sheer exhaustion. We've said before, Jesus did become a real human being who experienced all that real human beings do, like tiredness when you've worked hard. And again, if ever you've been involved in praying for people at the end of the meeting, it can be really tiring as you're listening to their story, then you're trying to listen to God for how you should pray. So this guy absolutely needs some R&R, but it's the last thing he gets a chance to get when all the crowds are just gathered again at the other side. And I think it would have been so easy to say, yep, that's it, that's enough. Or, okay, I'll give you all another 30 minutes, then just all go home, please, because I've had enough for today. No, not this Jesus.
He's always giving out.
Absolutely. And there's a lovely little verse towards the start of this story that says, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, now you might expect his heart sank. No, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. I mean, this is amazing. This is a guy who just keeps giving and giving and giving, even at cost to himself.
So he has compassion on them and then does what?
Well, the compassion then gets worked out in a very particular way. as I just said in a quick summary, the disciples come to him and said, look, this is a remote place, getting late, send the crowds away so they can go and buy food for themselves. And I love how Jesus answers. Here's the first surprise in our story. Jesus tells the disciples to feed the crowd themselves. In Matthew's account, we read this in Matthew 14, verse 16. He says, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. That's crazy. You know, there are at least 5,000 people here, we'll read as the story goes on. In fact, Matthew tells us that it's not just 5,000 people, it's 5,000 men besides the women and children. So it's Philip, the local boy, who says, Jesus, it would take 8 months' wages to feed this crowd. So clearly what Jesus has told them to do seems ridiculous. But let's see what we can do. Let's see if we can get around the crowd and get everybody to get their picnics out. Maybe we could do a church bring and share lunch, or the equivalent of it in those days. And Peter comes back and says, look, we've been through the whole crowd asking around, anyone got any food? And Peter says, all we've been able to muster is a little boy's picnic of 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. Let me just comment on that a little bit. This is what John's account tells us. He says it's a little boy's picnic. The word he uses there for little boy is that you'd use for like a youngster, sort of 4 or 5 years old. So that instantly tells you what size this picnic is going to be. 5 small barley loaves. Barley was the food of the poor. 2 small fish. Interesting, the Greek word that's used here for small fish was also used for what we would call today a tidbit, a little bit of a, taster to keep you going, as it were, a little snack. When my grandkids go out, we always take a little snack with them, just crackers or something, because they're bound to get hungry on the way. So here's this little boy who's got a few tidbits in his bag to keep him going until he comes home. 5 very small barley loaves. Think just small little things that would fit in your hand. 2 small fish, maybe sort of sardine type things. That's all we've managed to gather, Peter says. In other words, this is ludicrously small and inadequate in light of the size of the crowd.
So at best, a child-sized portion for 5,000 or more adults.
This is crazy, Jesus. And that's exactly what the disciples feel.
How does Jesus respond then to the facts in front of them?
He responds by a few more surprising things. He says, okay, what I want you to do is to get everyone seated. First of all, obviously they've been standing and listening to his teaching. So he gets everyone seated. So this immediately looks like he's going to do something, doesn't it?
And you'd also get a sense of the scale of the crowd, presumably.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's at that point that the gospel writers note the numbers. A crowd of 5,000, or as I said, Matthew noting 5,000 men besides the women and children. Matthew, writing for a Jewish audience, would be very sensitive to how men and women would be separated in situations like that. And so it being even more obvious that, my goodness, there are 5,000 here just of the men, let alone their wives and their kids. So when we talk about the feeding of the 5,000, it was almost certainly significantly more than that. So now the problem seems to become even bigger, as it's not just heads in crowds, but they're suddenly aware of the enormity of what lies in front of them.
So they're seated, And you kind of imagine Jesus is then going to make some sort of announcement to explain what's going to have to happen.
Yeah, but what he does is something very sort of personal and intimate. He says to his disciples, bring the 5 loaves and the 2 small fish here. And while the people have all been sitting down, we read that Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and he looked up to heaven, gave thanks for them, broke the loaves. Now, what he's doing there is nothing surprising at all. That is what any good Jew would do. This is a thoroughly Jewish practice, giving thanks to God, the provider and creator of all things, before you ate a meal. But what he does then, having given thanks and broken the loaves, it then says he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. And they all ate and were satisfied. So where does this miracle happen? Is it in Jesus' hands as he breaks the bread and hands a piece and breaks the bread and hands a piece? Or is it what I think the text is suggesting here, that it happened in the hands of his disciples? He gave it to them and they gave it to the people. So he's done his bit. He's broken what he's got, into 12 portions for his 12 disciples. Now they have to give it. And can you imagine, David, just standing there with this? I mean, there'd have been a tiny bit of bread in your hand and a very small bit of fish. And you're standing there thinking, okay, Jesus, and you break a piece off the bread, but as you do, it miraculously becomes larger. And you hand it to the people. So it looks like the miracle is happening in their hands as they are handing it to the people. And as I read this story, I'm reminded of the story of the widow who had a tiny amount of oil left.
In the story of Elisha in the Old Testament.
A story that we've looked at earlier in this series. And Elisha says to her, send to all your neighbours and get as many jars as you can from them. And tells her that as she keeps pouring from the one little jar of oil that she's got left, as she pours it, each of these jars will be filled. And they're filled and they're filled and they're filled and they're filled until there are no more jars available from the neighbours. And at that point, the oil stops flowing. The miracle happened as she responded in faith to Elisha's word and poured it. And I think that's what happens here. As the disciples trust what Jesus said and break it, each time they break it in their hands, it multiplies and they go around and feed the whole jolly lot of them.
Helpful to remember maybe that the disciples aren't Jesus' assistants, they're his disciples.
Yeah, and disciple means apprentice, learning. They're learning how to do this stuff. He's training, he's mentoring them. By the time we get to Acts, of course, we'll see them doing many miracles in their own right. But here they're in this training phase, learning stage of doing things. He'll send them out in twos at one point to heal the sick, and they'll come back with exciting stories of what they saw happened as they prayed in the name of Jesus. So this is very much a mentoring situation. I mean, it would have been so easy, wouldn't it, for Jesus to say, okay, guys, stand back, watch this. And for him to do the multiplying and for them to say, wow, Jesus, what a great person you are. Do you know what? Still today, there are some engaged in Christian ministry who can end up wanting the spotlight on them, the focus on them. They're the one who brings the great message or prays the great prayer of healing for people. But for me, the most effective ministries are those who don't just do it. They're those who multiply it by mentoring and training others to do it and giving them a go and sending them out and risking it. And that's what Jesus does with his disciples. Wow, would that we followed that pattern more today.
I also noticed that this tiny meal that this little boy brought could have been overlooked, could have been ignored, but it was taken by Jesus and used.
Yes, and it's almost like the disciples overlook it, don't they? Because when they bring it to Jesus, there isn't any food. Well, there's just this little boy's 5 loaves and 2 fish, and it would have been so easy to overlook that, but Jesus doesn't overlook it. And I love just an underlying theme here of, we may not have much to give, but all we need to do is to give to Jesus what we can give, and Jesus will multiply it and use it way beyond what we could ever have done with, what we keep and what we try to hold to ourselves has a way of shriveling up and disappearing. But what we release to him, he is able to take and multiply, and he never despises anyone who comes with their equivalent today of their 5 small loaves and 2 small fish. There might be an appeal at your church for something. There might be an appeal here on UCB that we do a couple of times a year for our listener-funded radio station. And, you may not feel that you can give what you hear some others giving. So-and-so from Shrewsbury has just donated £1,000. Listen, if all you can donate is £1, donate that £1, whether it's to UCB or your church or whatever it might be, and see what God will do out of what you have and what you freely give, not out of what you don't have.
So a miracle it was that more than 5,000 people were fed from this small donation, if you like, from this little boy.
And not only were 5,000 fed, or 5,000 plus, if it's the women and children, we read that there was loads over. I mean, that's a lovely bit of this story. The story ends like this. So this is Matthew's version of the story here. He gave them to all the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 baskets full of broken pieces that were left over. Now, if that's not another surprise in this story, I don't know what was. 12 baskets full left. So there's not only, this is like people have not just had enough. They've had more than their fill, and there's 12 baskets full left over. What a picture here of God's big, generous, liberal, giving heart.
We live in a world where there's a lot of food waste. So you don't think this is a situation where there was food wasted?
Not at all, because Jesus very specifically tells his disciples to waste nothing, to gather it up, presumably then to be distributed at some other point or maybe the next day. So he specifically tells them to collect the leftovers. I love that. I mean, here is the man who could so easily have said a prayer and done the same miracle all over again. But no, he doesn't want to. He wants them to learn a sense of human responsibility and accountability. So tells them to waste nothing, to gather, and ending up with these 12 baskets full at the end. Interesting, the very fact that they count and note for us, there were 12 baskets full. Obviously, 12 was significant in Jewish thinking. It was the number of the tribes, therefore 12 always symbolized the whole of God's people. Here's certainly a picture of how Jesus can feed not just these 5,000, but the whole of God's people. But yeah, this emphasis on not being wasteful, I think that has a huge message for us today, where particularly in the West, we can be a very, very wasteful society. You watch some of these programs on TV where presenters go in and help them reduce their spend because you discover they're spending £1,000 a week on food. And I think, what? How can you spend that much? And they go through their fridge and they discover that there's this left and that left, or that they're throwing food away. We live in a very wasteful society. And, for anyone who's traveled as I have to developing nations where you see people scrimping and scraping for food and where food is precious, that is so embarrassing to live in a culture where that happens. And I think, one of the spin-offs from this story is Jesus would challenge us about the amount of waste. And if we are wasting food and throwing food away, then we're buying too much food. And what could we do with the money that we'd use to buy that food we're throwing away? Well, we could have given it away. We could have donated it to people who don't have resources. We could give it to charities who work with the poor. But there's a huge challenge here to us in our culture not to be a wasteful society.
Thinking of this from the perspective of the crowd, 5,000 plus people, this provision must have seemed like manna from heaven.
I think that's exactly how it must have seemed. And in fact, in John's account of this story, it will lead Jesus to go on to talk about not just earthly bread, but heavenly bread, and how he is the bread that comes down from heaven. And in that, in John 6, he'll actually say, I tell you the truth, it's not Moses who's given you the bread from heaven, but my Father who gives you bread from heaven. So clearly, the disciples and presumably the larger crowd were thinking, my goodness, hang on. Can't we remember a story from our scriptures where an anointed man of God provided for God's people when they were hungry, just as Moses had prayed and God had provided quail and manna and water in the wilderness. Here now is someone who's doing the same. And so alarm bells are starting to go off in their thinking, without a doubt, out of this miracle.
You said in previous conversations that this account in John's Gospel is another of those signs. John chose to record this story to point to something. What is he pointing to?
Yeah, John will pick this up at the end of this feeding of the 5,000 story. He has an interesting little comment in John's Gospel. John 6:14 says that after the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who's come into the world. So the penny is starting to drop. But here's the interesting verse that follows. Jesus, knowing they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. So he realizes that with the common current expectation that Messiah would be a military and political delivery, and that's what they wanted to try and push him into, he withdraws, he crosses over to the other side of the lake yet again. But they find him and say, well, how did you get here? And he begins to challenge what they had been looking for and wanting. He says to them, I tell you the truth, you're looking for me not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. You're in this for what you can get out of it. Quite a challenge to us there, isn't it? But then he'll go on to teach them about not working for food that spoils like bread and fish, but rather working for food that endures to eternal life, food that the Son of Man will bring. And he'll go on to talk about himself being the bread of heaven, the bread of life, bread that comes down from God. Bread now, not physical bread, but a picture of that which sustains our lives. Jesus is saying, that's me. The Father has sent me to be that which sustains your life.
You mentioned earlier that two particular disciples are highlighted, Philip and Peter. Philip said it would have cost 8 months' wages to feed all these people. Peter says, all we've got is this small meal. I'm sure you'd love to have seen the look on their faces. What do you think went through their minds?
Again, do what we've often said in this series. Try and put yourself in the story. Imagine what and how they might have felt. On the one hand, disbelief because Jesus, I'm sorry, but you are asking us to feed this lot. 8 months' wages would just about do it. Peter, Lord, we've been around taking a collection, 5 small barley loaves, 2 small fish. So really there's incredulity, isn't there, in both of them, but for very different reasons. One for what it would cost, the other for what they've managed to gather. So, yeah, a measure of incredulity, disbelief, and yet they're about to see not only Jesus do the miracle, they're about to see Jesus do the miracle through them. They're about to see it happen in their own hands. And of course, Jesus going on to say, look, the real miracle is not the multiplication of the bread and fish. The real miracle starts when people see the one to whom this miracle points. Remember, it's a sign, John says, a pointer. What is this miracle pointing to? It's pointing to me being the bread of life. And he'll actually go on to say that, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I'll raise him up on the last day. That must have been a big surprise to them. Eating human flesh, drinking human blood, both forbidden in the Jewish law. Of course, Jesus was looking ahead here to the Last Supper, when he would, in that Passover meal, take bread and wine and give it new significance, saying the broken bread is pointing to my broken body on the cross, the wine symbolizing his blood shed for us. And of course, the disciples don't understand that at this point. It would only be later, as they look back, that they will grasp it. In John's Gospel, we read that at this point, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?" And he goes on to say, from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. There's something weird going on here. Now, Jesus, all this stuff about life and death and eating your flesh and drinking your blood, I think we part ways here. So from the doubt and the incredulity of Philip and Peter at the start of the miracle, to the crowd actually saying, now what this miracle is pointing to is, sorry, a bit too much for us, and them backing off. This is a story that's full of surprises from start to finish.
And bringing the story up to date, can Jesus continue to perform miracles through us today?
Absolutely. And I've experienced some myself. I've prayed for people and seen them miraculously healed. I have to add quickly to that, I've also prayed for people and not seen them miraculously healed. Why some and not others, I don't know. But what I do know is that Jesus sent out his disciples in his lifetime to preach the good news of the kingdom and to pray for those who were sick and to seek to heal them. That's what the early church did in the book of Acts. And I think that challenge still remains for us today, to be a church that not only speaks words, but turns those words into action. And part of that action will be, yes, the caring for the poor and the community grocers and all those other practical things so many churches do. But if we utterly back off ever daring to step out and ask God to do a miracle and praying for those who are sick or in need, I'm really not sure we're being the sort of authentic Christian that we find there in the New Testament. And I think this unforgettable picnic is just one of many miracles and many signs that say to us, come on, guys, despite your incredulity, could you just step out with me? And let's see what might happen when we give God a chance.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.